My topic is the effects. Well, there is a more specific question that I asked, but this is the general gist of the subject, and it's the effects of invasive plant species on native pollinators. Um, as I said, biodiversity loss is, like I said, it depends on who you ask, but it's considered the second most threatening thing to the environment after global warming. So I'll kind of start with where I got my question from, and then I'll show you my question and then kind of go with the research from there. So pollinators, we kind of all know what pollinators are, but they're animals that move pollen from the male parts of a flower to the female parts of the flower so that the plants can fertilize their seeds. These are things like hummingbirds, bats, butterflies, bees, beetles, flies, and there are some more specific region examples. They're pretty interesting. They're honey possums in Australia. They're these tiny little possums that actually just crawl up on the flowers and drink the nectar out of them. And then there's a lemur in Madagascar that helps fertilize some of the plants there. 80% of the world's flowering plants need pollinators. So they are pretty important. And about 1,200 of the crops that we rely on need pollinators to grow. These are things like coffee, sugar. I listed some of the more popular ones here. But yeah, coffee and chocolate, pretty big ones. So the other thing I kind of went with was invasive plants. So what are invasive plants? They're non-native to the area, so it kind of depends where you're at and whether or not a plant's invasive. They do have a tendency to spread and cause damage, and they're not to be confused with exotic species. Exotic species are plants that are non-native, but they don't cause damage. So in the United States, some of the top invasive plants, the number one is purple loosestrife up here in the top right. It's pretty common. It's kind of at the point where they don't really know what to do about it because there's so much of it. Japanese honeysuckle is another big one. I know we have some of that around here. And then kudzu is another big one. You can see that image down there in the bottom right. It is an absolute mess. I believe they planted it along interstates to help control plant spread and erosion. So now it's just a mess and it's everywhere and it takes over everything. So the other thing I kind of had to go into is how invasive plants work. There's a few different ways that they do that. They usually do it by taking over the environment. They compete with they compete with the native plants for the resources that plants need, like sunlight and moisture, soil nutrients, and just space in general. A lot of invasive plants produce a lot of seeds. Some of them up in the around 10,000 seeds per plant range. A lot of them have very wide root systems. They're very wide and shallow, so they actually take up a lot of space underground. So it's kind of hard to tell just by looking at them that they're taking up space, but other plants can't grow if their root systems are in the way. And then another one that a lot of them seem to have is chemicals that are noxious to other plants. There are some invasive plants will actually kill nearby plants. They'll give off certain chemicals that kill nearby plants. I put deception here. A lot of invasive plants actually kind of look like other plants that are native, and as a result, the local wildlife are really unable to tell the difference, and I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. A lot of the times, these things are unknowingly spread by animals, humans, and other things like wind and water. On the right there, that's a plant called I guess the name that we call it is myelminid or devil's tail. You can see up on the top right, it's actually little barbs along the stem there. Those actually get caught on everything. They'll stick to tires, they'll stick to your shoes or pants, they'll stick to animal fur, and they get carried away. As you can see in the bottom right, it's kind of like the kudzu just completely takes over the area that it's in. mile a minute actually grows, I believe one plant can grow about 30 feet in a season, which is why they call it that. It grows very quickly, and it grows, and there's usually a ton of it everywhere, and it makes a mess. So here's a local example of what I was talking about with the biodiversity loss. The West Virginia white butterfly. It's a species of concern. It's a butterfly that is native to West Virginia, obviously, but it goes up and around the Great Lakes as well. It's actually affected by the garlic mustard invasion that we have in the United States. The toxic properties of garlic mustard actually kill the larva, or some of the larvae. It's a pretty large percentage. It kind of depends on the area. And garlic mustard actually outcompetes the native wildflowers. So this butterfly relies on the native flowers to live, and garlic mustard is killing it off. So it's actually seeing a decrease in the population of this butterfly. And I'll show you, it relies on toothwort. And this next slide is actually a comparison between toothwort and garlic mustard. Now, on the left is the toothwort, and on the right is the garlic mustard. Now, I can barely tell the difference, and I'm sure that a butterfly can't really tell at all. They'll lay their eggs on the leaves. The larva will hatch, and they'll feed off the leaves. And on the garlic mustard, the toxins kill the larva. So knowing all of this information, I had to put it all together. So pollinators are a common theme in nature. They're everywhere. There are regional differences between plants and then the pollinators themselves. The invasive plants do have mechanisms that take over the environment and make them very hardy and resilient. And native flower visitors may lose their habitats due to this invasive plant takeover. So my question that I kind of looked into overall was, do invasive plant species negatively impact native pollinator populations? This is a concern because if you lose your pollinators, then you lose more plants, and then you lose more biodiversity, and then there's more takeover. So it was kind of where I started. Well, what the research shows is a bit unfortunate. There's little to no research has been done on the effects of the populations themselves, I could say. The reason for this is it's very situational. Every location is different. Every environment is different. The plants, the animals that are there, everything is different. So it's really hard to actually study this thing. Most of the research that has been done on the community level impacts. So the overall effect that these things have on their surrounding environment rather than just on the individual pollinators themselves. Normally they compare invaded and not invaded habitats. That's what most of the research has been done on. And this was a quote directly from the study that I was looking into initially. It says, it's impractical to study every invasive plant in every ecological context. So it's really difficult to do this kind of research, which is a bit disappointing to me, but it makes a lot more sense now that I know about it. So the way that they actually study these things, you can see on the left there, it's a bit grainy looking, but when they look at the scales of the studies, like I said before, most of the research has been done on the community level. So what they're looking at for that is the abundance of species, the species richness, and overall composition of that community. Populations, studying populations is pretty difficult. A lot of insects don't live in the open. They live in nests or underground or things such that way. So it's hard to do that without disturbing them and messing up your study. And studying individuals is nearly impossible because insects are very small and they're very fast, and it's very difficult to track them. So unfortunately, there's really not a whole lot of research. There is very little on the actual populations. But I'll go into a little more about the interactions and why there's not as much research. So in terms of pollinating plants that need pollinated, you can see on the left there that the interaction between the flower visitors and the invasive plants is the same as it is for the native plants. Invasive plants provide food, and the pollinators pollinate the plants. Those invasive plants also compete with the native plants for the space and the resources. But indirectly, what you see is that the pollinators then will not pollinate the native plants as much just because there's other food available. And so there's less plants for the pollinators to use in the future. A lot of the invasive plants actually form relationships with those pollinators, and most of the time the pollinators are generalists. So that means that they're not doing one specific plant, things like bees or moths, some butterflies. They're pretty general. There's some beetles that do the same thing. And some studies have actually shown that invasive plants will form relationships with pollinators from different functional groups. So there's actually, I forget what the plant was, but there are some plants that will be pollinated by birds in one part of the world, but they'll actually be pollinated by insects in another part of the world. So you can see it's pretty difficult to actually study this. But some plants can also self-pollinate. This makes them more resilient, makes them more adaptable to different environments because they don't rely on anything to self-pollinate. Garlic mustard, which you see on the left there, is actually an example of this, and it's an issue in this area as well. It's a plant that was brought from Europe as a medicinal plant, but now it kind of escaped, and it's all over the U.S. now. And something interesting that I did find was that some plants are shown to be self-incompatible, which means they can't self-pollinate in their native habitat, but they are able to self-pollinate in the invasive areas. So again, it's really difficult to actually study and find out, the answer to the question that I asked. And then there's another way that plants actually spread. It's called vegetative spread. It's a process where only a part of a plant is needed to grow a new plant. So just fragments of another plant can actually result in a new plant. They don't need seeds or anything. Japanese barberry is a really good example of this. You see it up on the top. It's actually a plant that was brought from Japan as a decorative plant because people like the way it looks. Well, it turns out that it has the mechanisms to be very invasive. Only a little part of it actually needs to be onto the ground. When you remove it, you actually have to either burn it or let it desiccate somewhere. And one of the things with this is that it can form what's called clonal colonies. So it's likely that this bush on the right side of the screen is actually all completely genetically similar. Yeah, that's what will happen is you don't even need pollinators for this process to happen. So when you're looking at quantifying the effects of these different plants on pollinators, they do a few different kinds of tests. They do simulated invasion, so they use potted plants or branches, and they'll just stick them in a new environment, and then what they can see is the effect on what the flower visitors do. So that's one of the pros, is they can actually directly measure the response to the new plant. The cons to this, however, is it only really shows the behavioral changes. It doesn't really show any kind of community impacts of the new plant. So the other way that they study this is with natural experiments, which is what is ideal. They'll try to study invaded versus non-invaded environments, and they look for what they'll do is they'll compare the abundance or species richness of plant and insects there. And then something else they can do is actually do invader removal, so they can compare the removed sites with non-invaded sites. Some of the pros to this is the invaded environment's already adjusted, so changes will affect the community overall if they actually do decide to remove the invaders or do any kinds of tests. The cons to this is that experimental design is very difficult and make it difficult to come to any conclusions. No two environments are going to be the same. If the two study sites are too close by, then the more mobile insects will just move. They don't need to sit around. They can just fly away. So it's really difficult to actually quantify this kind of information. So the overall conclusion was that my initial question with whether or not invasive plants affect pollinator populations, it's a bit too broad. The diversity of plants and the pollinators make it really difficult to give a solid answer about that. It's way more context specific. It's more focused on the individual areas or geographical areas where those things occur. So basically, the relationship between the invasive plants and native pollinators is complicated, and it's really not well researched. It's very time consuming. It's generally not considered too big of a, I guess, on an individual population level, it's not really considered too big of a threat. So it kind of just depends. Yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate answer, I guess, but that's kind of what the research has shown me. So yeah, it's kind of